Hello, and welcome to this webinar on school aid concepts voters care about. I am Deborah Cunningham. I'm Director of Education and Research for ASBO, New York. I have spent most of my career at the New York State Education Department, where I developed Regents state aid proposals for 22 different years, including the year that led to the enactment of Foundation Aid in 2007. And presenting with me is Dr. Andrew Van Alstyne, Deputy Director of Education and Research at ASBO, who has joined ASBO 2 years ago, and he has a PhD from the University of Michigan, and he has brought tremendous analytical capability to ASBO. So this is a presentation that we did yesterday, February 26th, to legislative staff in the Legislative Office Building. We had a good response, a lot of engagement, and we thought we would record it for others that might be interested in viewing this at a later time, including people in business offices of school districts that might be new to school finance or have a new need to understand state aid to school districts in a more comprehensive way. School aid is complex. It is governed by a number of formulas, formula components, budget mechanisms, and despite that complexity, the foundation of it can be broken down into concepts that the public cares about and can understand. So this comprehensive review of school aid will position you for conversations with lawmakers and constituents about school aid. It's going to be a fast-paced presentation. We're going through a lot of slides, but then you will have a comprehensive overview of New York State school aid in a relatively short time. We welcome your ideas about ways we can help you do your jobs and research that will help you make your case to your communities, and at the end we'll give you some email addresses for you to write to us with. This presentation has been posted on our state budget information page, and the URL is listed here. You can go to our asbonewyork.org website and find this and download this presentation. And we also put other information about the state budget on that page as it comes along. These include a comparison of different proposals and analyses of different aspects of the executive proposal, for example. So the presentation will look at the history of New York State school aid, the types and structures of public school districts in New York, the revenues that school districts get and how they spend it, the state budget process and the purposes of state school aid, and basic concepts in school aid. And we'll get into foundation aid and other forms of state aid to give you a sense of what the drivers are for those aids. And we'll conclude with a discussion of the executive proposal for the 2019 state budget and some research we've done on different areas of that, and conclude with some terminology and resources to learn more. First, the history. So, New York's statewide system of support for public schools began in the late 1700s with the creation of this statewide system. And then over the years, the legislature established different forms of school districts. Common schools were established in 1812, union free school districts in 1853, and then in 1914, and then an amendment in 1925, central school districts were established. At that time, there were more than 10,000 school districts, and in 1947, and then an amendment in 1958, the reorganization master plan was created and revised, and school aid was thought of as an incentive for school districts to merge to reduce the number of school districts for the benefit of students and taxpayers. Then in the late 1900s to the present time, the number of formulas, the amount of state aid, and the amount of school spending continued to grow. And at the same time, disparities in resources that were available to support education in different communities also increased. From 1993 to 2006, the Campaign for Fiscal Equity lawsuit went through the courts. The courts upheld parents' claim that the state was not providing children the opportunity for an adequate education. And as a result of this, in 2007, foundation aid was enacted and planned to be phased in over 4 years. This was really a breakthrough in New York State school finance in establishing an education-oriented, needs-based funding formula for schools. It included a pretty dramatic simplification of school aid. 30 different aids were consolidated into one. And it introduced, for the first time in operating aid, a regional cost as a factor and annual inflationary increases. And it made student need an important part of the formula. These were changes that had been recommended by certain state commissions, such as Salerno Commission, and but they've never made it into the laws. So finally it was in the laws. I think it's important to recognize these accomplishments and the value it is playing for school districts. However, the phase-in was never completed. The Great Recession hit, and the state was lacking the funds to fund the formula. But the formula does continue to be calculated in full every year with inflationary increases. So that amount is in the database that is produced in support of the state budget. Currently, there is about $4 billion outstanding for full phase-in of the formula, and each year the state phases in a part of the full formula. So where are we in 2019? The regents and education groups want full funding of foundation aid, and they're very adamant that this is an important element to the future success of school districts being able to produce students who are college and career ready. There are new lawsuits, the New Yorkers for Students' Educational Rights and the MISO lawsuit that claim that the foundation formula does appropriately align funding to need, and that the state is obligated to pay the amount due absent additional court findings. The governor, in contrast, says no, the formula is no longer relevant. It's a dinosaur of the past, but school districts' funding of schools is what's important. We're going to discuss this more when we get to the section on the executive proposal. So now we're going to look at New York State school districts, and because there are many different types of school districts in New York State, and the types of school districts are usually referenced in the laws related to state school aid and other requirements. So one of the first questions we get is, how many school districts are there? And it really depends on how you count them. There are 682 K-12 school districts. Of those, 673 are major school districts. That means they have 8 or more teachers. And of those 673, 668 are independent. That means they have the ability to tax and borrow and hold budget votes. Whereas 5, our big 5 city school districts, are dependent on their cities, and so they're fiscally dependent. Then we have 5 minor school districts which have less than 8 teachers, and there are 3 non-operating K-12 school districts. In addition, there are 13 special act school districts. These are school districts that are created through a special act of the legislature to serve children in child caring institutions and in one children's hospital. There are 10 of these that are operating and 3 that are non-operating. So for a grand total of 694 school districts. So I generally say that there are about 700 school districts in New York State, But when we look at the school aid runs, we generally refer to the major school districts, the 673 major school districts. There also is a difference in school district structure. Back in the early 1900s, when there were 10,000 different school districts, most of those were common school districts, and they were just K-8 and in neighborhoods. Now there's only 11 common school districts left. Most school districts are union-free school districts or central school districts, and the centralization that resulted from mergers. There are 3 central high school districts that are located on Long Island, where the elementary school districts, separate elementary school districts, feed into a central high school district. There are 57 small city school districts and 5 large city school districts, for a total of 694 school districts. This slide looks at the number of school districts over the years. So you can see back in the late 1800s, there were more than 11,000 school districts. And in the far right column, you see the decrease in the number of school districts, how much the number declined over those years. And you can see from about 1930 to 1960, the number of school districts decreased by 9,000. That's a tremendous reduction through efforts to consolidate school districts, to merge school districts. That was much in response to state aid incentives that were provided. Then in 1970, you can see it beginning to start to slow down. And over the next 30 years or so, you see a greatly reduced rate of consolidations or mergers. And then since 2000, in the last 20 years, it has slowed down even further. And there's only about 10 mergers in that period. And the last one was in December of 2018, when Elizabethtown and Westport school districts merged just recently. In New York State, education is characterized by tremendous diversity. You're going to hear this throughout this presentation. And we're gonna, this diversity starts with the number of students that are enrolled in school districts. So what we see when we look at the number of school districts by enrollments in a recent year is that more than half of school districts are small and have fewer than 1,500 students. And then if we overlay the share of enrollment over the same graph, we see that many school districts have just a few number of students, those on the left-hand side, and a handful of school districts have many students on the right-hand side. Now, there are 5 school districts that educate 45% of the students, and those are our big 5 city school districts of New York City, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, and Yonkers. They are fiscally dependent on their municipalities, so they lack the authority to tax and borrow. They do not hold budget votes on their school budget. This is all done by their municipality on which they are dependent. This map shows you school districts in blue that are classified as rural, and we've used a standard of less than 25 students per square mile. So you can see that rural school districts are many, and they are in most parts of the state. In addition, we have 57 small city school districts. These were created in law some time ago. The designations are now old and do not reflect current realities. We have many cities that are smaller than towns. For example, the city of Batavia has a population of a little more than 15,000, but the town of Brookhaven has a population of more than 486,000. So small city school districts are 57, and school districts are not coterminous with city lines. So if a school district has even a portion of their school district in a city, it is classified as a small city school district. New York education is stronger and more powerful, provides many more opportunities because of its BOCES system, its regional education system. The BOCES were created to provide opportunities to students in small rural school districts. There are 37 of them. They provide shared services to 2 or more school districts around the state, things that school districts individually would have trouble paying for themselves because of the cost of equipment or specialized staff. In areas that are shared with BOCES are special education, career and technical education, professional development services to improve the effectiveness of teaching, and then a number of administrative functions such as business operations and facilities and human resource management. And it is important to note that there are a handful of school districts, the Big Five and a few others, that are not components of BOCES, and they separately receive special services aid for career and technical education, which is a requirement, a legal requirement for all students. The district superintendents serve as the CEOs of the BOCES, and they also serve as staff to the Commissioner of Education, as the commissioner's arm in the field, and they receive a part of their salary for each function. The Commissioner of Education and her designees oversee BOCES by approving what's known as cooperative service agreements, or COSERs. These COSERs define the sharing that BOCES will do and define whether aid is to be provided or not, and the BOCES is only allowed to operate within those parameters. We're going to get into school revenues and expenses. This slide looks at the share of school district revenues over a 10-year period by state, local, and federal. And the orange represents 2006-07, and the blue 10 years later in 2016-17. And you can see that most of school revenues come from state and local sources, and that the local share of school revenues is increasing. It increased almost 5% over this 10-year period, while state and local shares went down. Spending on education is currently $71 billion statewide. More than 3/4 of that is spent on instruction, teacher salaries, including fringe benefits. About 6% is spent on maintenance and operations of the school district, 5% on transportation, 5% on debt service for school construction, 3% on non-instructional benefits, and 2% on administration, and then a final 2% called classified as other, which includes things like interfund transfers, such as things like transfers to school food service fund. The state budget process is a process of data and proposals. It begins November 15th when the first database for the coming school year is released by the state education department. They have been collecting the information, which was due September 1st of that year, and they finally have it all together and presented to the Division of Budget and the general public by November 15th. Then in December, out comes the Regional State Aid proposal, spelling out the needs of school districts and making certain recommendations on state aid for the coming year. And in December and January, we see different advocate proposals. ASBO puts out a proposal, and the Education Conference Board puts out a proposal. And many organizations will weigh in on certain aspects. Rather than do a broad proposal, they might focus on one topic, such as early learning or something like that. Then in January, the governor comes out with his budget proposal to the legislature. February 15th, there is another data update from school districts that is available. And on-time enacted budgets use this database. So it's important to be aware of it. And then in mid-March, there are the one-house budgets that often come out from each house of the legislature. And then April 1st or after, there is a final budget approved with school aid runs. And I would just point out, for those of you who have been looking at school aid just in the last few years, that we're in a period of on-time budgets, but that hasn't always been the case. In the past, many budgets were months late as October. This slide looks at enacted budgets and what the legislature adds over the executive budget proposal. So you can see that there is a significant addition from the input of the legislature, from $200 million to almost $440 million was added in this last 8-year period in the legislative process. The budgets discuss a lot of concepts and needs and policy directions, but they also comply often with a shares agreement. The leadership in state government agrees on a certain percentage to New York City, Long Island, and the rest of the state, and then their final action generally complies with that. I've been watching school aid for 30 years, and this has happened all but 1 year in my experience, and that was when the state was determined to end the GEA, the gap elimination adjustment, which had placed cuts on school districts. And that year, they provided a greater share to Long Island, which was due the most in gap elimination reduction. So that's a reality that we have to live with. Now, Andrew is going to talk about why and how state aid works, and then I'll come back and conclude with a discussion of the executive budget proposal.
Thank you. Before we get into the specific mechanisms that the state aid process uses, I want to first touch on some of the underlying philosophy of state aid. So why does the state give aid to public school districts? A number of reasons. First, because the state's a partner in education, there's an idea that it should provide some level of support to all public school districts. So all districts, from the poorest to the wealthiest, will receive some form of state aid. But to make education opportunity equitable, the state also has a role to ensure that variations in either student need or the availability of local resources don't prevent any district from offering an adequate education to its students. So the state provides a greater share of resources to districts that have either high levels of student need and or fewer relative fiscal resources locally. Finally, the state uses grant programs to help foster innovation and identify new programs that, if successful, can be spread throughout the state. And beyond the philosophy, there's also the constitutional requirement that the state has to provide a sound basic education for all students. This is undergirds a lot of the lawsuits that Deborah mentioned in her presentation. So the state doesn't just have a moral obligation to provide education, it has a constitutional legal requirement as well. So how does the state do this? Let's look through state aid. Through a series of formulas and aid ratios and student weights, the state allocates resources. So formulas are simply that, a mathematical formula where you put variables in that determines how much goes to each district. Aid ratios are calculated relative to either need or resources in the district to determine the state's share of something. And finally, weights are adding an additional level to account for student need. So high need students, students with disabilities, English language learners, students in poverty all cost more, significantly more to educate, and so the state allocates additional resources based on their presence in the district. State aid is also subject to a growth cap. But now it's an annual growth in income. The governor has proposed changing this from a 1-year to a 10-year average in the executive budget. Part of this is because the income growth is large times. But this is the framework within which school aid operates. So the growth is limited to this cap. Before we turn to these formulas and ratios, I want to look at student need and go through how are students changing. First, overall enrollment, and then each of these categories of need. So student poverty, economic disadvantage, disabilities, special learners, and then geographic sparsity, because not only do levels of student need demand more resources to provide the same levels of education, all things being equal, rural districts face additional costs. So these are what drive increases in educational costs and the state's share. Now, on the whole, we see a steady dip in enrollment in our state from just over 2.7 million to just under 2.65 million over the last 7 years. And this is something experienced by most, but not all school districts. So we look at the 5-year change. 42 districts have actually seen pretty significant growth, so 5% or more over the last 5 years. Growth is, can be good, but it also presents enormous challenges for districts, whether it's physical space, staffing, transportation. But 42 districts have seen the significant growth, and then 96 have seen lower levels of growth, either flat enrollment up to 5% growth. And then we get the experience that most districts are experiencing, which is declines. So 213 districts have declined up to 5% decline. Another 202 have seen between 5 and 10% declines. And then we see really significant declines, so 10 to 15%, 15% or more. And at this scale, these are incredibly serious challenges for districts because a lot of resources are allocated in some way based on per pupil or pupil counts. Declining enrollments mean fewer resources, but districts face a lot of fixed costs. So these are districts that often find themselves in significant financial challenges. And there is a relationship between student need, and local resources. So this graph here uses combined wealth ratio decile, and what's being combined here are two forms of resources in the district: property wealth and local income. And then the state combines those into a measurement, and we split these into groups of 10. So 10%, the least wealthy districts, have 75% of their students eligible for free or reduced price lunches. You see pretty steady decline all the way down to the 10% of most wealthy school districts. Only 17% of students are eligible for reduced price lunch. I do want to point out that even in the wealthiest 10% of districts, 17% of students are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. So while there's a big variation, economic need is present in the vast majority of districts to some degree. This is the statewide free or reduced price lunch rate, from just under half to now a slight majority of students are eligible. The eligibility benchmarks for free lunch are 130% of the poverty rate, and the benchmark for reduced price lunch is 185% of the poverty rate. So a little more than half of New York students live in households that are under 185% of poverty rate. And absolute poverty itself is higher than New York than an average. So As a whole, the most recent annual data, 13.4% of U.S. residents live in poverty, where 14.1% of New York residents do. And poverty is concentrated by age. So young children are disproportionately likely to live in poverty. So for school-age children, 17.3% of school-age children in the U.S. Live in poverty. In New York, it's 18.9%. This has declined. So we've started pre-recession, we were 17.9%. Now we're down to 18.9%. So we're still above where we were, but we see a big peak in the aftermath of the recession, going up as high as 21.7%. In addition to economic hardship and poverty, the rate of students with disabilities is also growing from 12-13% 10 years ago to more than 15% now. Seeing also growth in English language learners. Unlike economic hardship, which most districts have some students eligible for free or reduced price lunch, even though it varies, and students with disabilities, which again, most districts have some form of students with disabilities, though they are slightly more prevalent in high-need districts. English language learners are more concentrated. So, more than half of New York's districts have either no English language learners up to less than 1% of their enrollment. The other 14% have 1% to less than 2%. So while they're growing, most districts don't have significant numbers, if any, English language learners. However, the presence of English language learners is in itself a demand for resources for staffing and language help, but it's a large challenge for districts where English language learners make up a significant number of the enrollment, particularly since there's not a common non-English language that's spoken. So New York State students speak an incredible amount of languages. So a district that has 5% English language learners may have a dozen or more languages present in it, and in big cities even more. State aid, well, it runs a lot of categories. 5 of these formulas account for 96% of state aid. The largest one, 2/3 of state aid, goes to foundation aid. This is the unrestricted aid that school districts rely on to support their operations. Beyond this, the next largest category is building aids, which makes up 12% of education aid, and the transportation aid, BOCES, and the special services aids, and funded special education. These 5 categories account for 96% of state aid. So let's go through the largest one, foundation aid. The premise of foundation aid is that it is an empirical determination of what it costs to educate students, and then it helps ensure that there are additional resources provided for students with significant needs, whether it's poverty, economic hardship, disabilities, English language learners. And then it asks what share of this can local districts provide, and what does the state need to provide to ensure adequate education provided to all students. So that first step is the determination of foundation amount. This can either be recalculated every year from a new study or adjusted for inflation. But this was originally determined based on a measure of successful schools that made efficient use of resources to successfully educate their students. And so we have a foundation amount, and then we say how much of this foundation amount, if we look at local property wealth and local income, how much of this can we expect a local district to be able to provide? Not what do they actually provide, what is their look like, but what can the state reasonably expect them to provide, and then how many students do they have. And that is the step to foundation aid. Counting the students also will involve waiting for students. The foundation amount, regional adjustment, because New York's a large state with significant economic diversity, so a cost in one place isn't the same as another. And then not all students cost the same to educate, so there's a people need index that takes factors of economic hardship, English language learners, and geographical sparsity into account. And then we look at the local contributions, so local resources. The two methods for determining this are emphasized variably: income or property, and the district's most favorable calculation. And that again is the reasonable effort, not what they actually raised. And then the enrollment is adjusted to account for students' disabilities, but also students that don't attend public schools, students in charter schools, students going to BOCES. And this adjusted and weighted enrollment is multiplied by this adjusted foundation amount. And that brings us to the foundation aid. Now, the fiscal capacity varies tremendously between districts. So the state uses need resource capacity categories, or NRCs, to classify districts among these 6 categories, but more generally speaking, into high need, average need, and low need. So high need districts are split in 4 categories. There's New York City, which is its own, the other large 4 city districts, the big 4, and then high need urban suburban school districts and high need rural school districts. And then the other 2 categories are average need and low need districts. And this chart shows the median property value and the median income per student in each of these categories. And we see enormous variations in both property value and income. So New York City, because of all the wealth present, has relatively high property values and income per student, but less than low need school districts, but higher than everyone else. And then we see low levels of income in the big 4, high need rural, high need urban, suburban, and then property wealth lowest is in the big 4. So we see all of this variation, which is why foundation aid and funding foundation aid is so critical. Now, the NRC categories are great, but they're a little too broad in some ways. So if we split them into a little more detail, we go back to those combined wealth ratio deciles and look at how much property value per student there is. We see that there's an enormous swing from $220,000 per student, least wealthy decile, up to $3 million per student in the wealthiest decile. So these are a broad range of resources that local districts have to draw upon. We would see similar kinds of swings, different numbers, similar kinds of swings when we look at income. So resources vary tremendously. Need also varies tremendously. So this takes those NRC categories and looks at the presence of student need and free reduced price lunch eligibility, students with disabilities, and English language learners are all much more prevalent in high need school districts. English language learners in particular are overwhelmingly concentrated in high need districts. So high need rural have 0%, average need of 1%, low need of 2%, and it's high need urban suburban in the big 5 cities where most English language learners live. So foundation aid is the critical resource for school districts, particularly still school districts that have high levels of student need and or low local fiscal capacity. Problem is, as you're probably aware if you've heard anyone talk about education in New York, is that we've not committed to paying foundation aid, and that we are spending billions, but the formula that says this is what it should cost and what the state needs to provide is far off from being funded. So there's it goes down every year, but it's going down far too gradually. So in the last few years, it's gone down from 3.8 to 3.7 to 3.5 billion dollar foundation aid still due after the budget is passed. At this rate, we're not going to get there anytime soon. So looking at the last 2 enacted budgets, we see relatively small increases in terms of making an impact on foundation aid still due. So the 3.7 and 3.5 billion still due are small because two things. The cost of education goes up, student need has been rising, and then the state also provides guarantees that districts won't see cuts in aid. So the combination of all those means that the state has made a relatively small dent in foundation aid still due. Even while it's true that it targets most of the aid increases to high need districts. And the districts that need it the most are the ones that have the most still due. So going back to the combined wealth ratio deciles again, huge jump, right? So the poorest decile, the ones with the least local wealth, which also has those astounding levels of student need, are the ones that are not getting resources from the state. The foundation aid still due per student there is more than $3,000 per student, and it goes down gradually, and then there's sort of leveling off, and then we see the particularly the wealthiest decile, very low foundation aid still due. If we look at it by need resource capacity category, it's high need urban suburban, so a lot of the small high need cities are what drive this, that have the most foundation aid still due, and then the big four are by far the two largest categories.
Thank you, Andrew. And now we're going to look at improving school aid. And we're going to start with a review of the executive budget proposal to the legislature that came out in January. And there's about 4 different aspects of the proposal that we think are noteworthy. The first is the level of the proposal. The governor proposed a $956 million increase, which is 3.6%. This includes $338 million for foundation aid, including a community schools set aside. The ASBO had recommended a $2.1 billion increase. The regents had recommended a $2 billion increase, and the Education Conference Board also. This level is very low. If you look at this chart in the third column, the foundation aid increase, you can see that for every category of school districts, the increase is less than 3%. And for school districts outside of New York City, the increase is less than 2%. So this is less than inflation. It's definitely not going to help us make progress in ensuring that all students have the opportunity for a meaningful education. The second point about this chart is that foundation aid still due is still quite high. It's greater than $2,000 per pupil in some of our neediest school districts, the high need urban suburban school districts and the big 4. So this is a concern, and I know the reason that it's high in the neediest school districts is not that the state has chosen not to fund them. They are funding them, but that the needs are greater than the state is choosing to fund. So there's a little different distinction there, where there is, by bringing student poverty into the foundation aid formula in 2007, there was a much bigger lift to go with the high need school districts than with others. And so that's where the need still is. The governor proposed equity plans for school districts who reported school level budgets the year before. And the equity plans are going to require the school districts, based on the data that they submitted, to provide at least 5% more funding in high need schools. Statewide, there are 410 school districts that are still underfunded with foundation aid, including 57 of the 76 school districts that reported last year and would have to comply with these new mandates. So we see this as putting the cart before the horse. The state is requiring school districts to distribute their money in an adequate fashion before the state has provided the adequate funding to the school district. And if you look at those 57 school districts that have to report and have foundation aid still due, there's $2.3 billion and $1 billion outside of New York City that is still due to them. The state has not provided. This is $1,600 per pupil across the board. And for school districts other than New York City, it's more than $3,000 per pupil that is not being provided. So again, we say, Governor, this is an initiative that may provide value, may provide different additional equity and additional transparency, but the school districts need to get their resources first from the state before they can ensure that it's being distributed to their schools adequately. Governor also proposes a services aid proposal beginning in 2020-21. This would consolidate 11 aids into a block grant and then increase the block grant each year by inflation and enrollment. These 11 aids are textbook aid, library materials aid, computer software, hardware, BOCES, supplemental public excess cost aid, transportation aid, special services aid, academic enhancement aid, high tax aid, and charter transitional aid. So we looked at all of these 11 aids, and two jumped out of us. Many of them were held by legislative appropriation pretty flat over the recent past. But two aids are expense-based aid. As the expenses increase, the state share increases. And those are BOCES aid and transportation aid. And this chart shows for the last 4 years, including the estimate for 1920, what the increase would be under current law. For BOCES aid, 7%, then 3%, then 4%, and 4%. You know, it's a steady increase in costs, and similar for transportation aid. And then we don't know what school districts what the data will be like in 2021, but we used the methods for previous year's data and showed the projected growth rate using the governor's proposal. And the result is a dramatic reduction, as you can see, 0.1%, 1%, 2%, and 2% versus 4, 3, 7%. So we are not sure why the governor would combine such disparate aids, and we see that BOCES and transportation aids would be the most effective, and that those are aids that provide opportunities for students. And we analyzed the impact by school district group and found that the impact would be greatest on high need rural and average need school districts. So we have a little research brief on this on our state budget page, but we just point out that this would be a pretty radical cut for many school districts, and that if that the burden would be shifted to local taxpayers. The governor also proposed, beginning in 2021, a new tier of building aid. And we have analyzed this as well using data for 1920 and putting in the governor's proposed changes. And we see a rather dramatic drop in building aid for different groups of school districts. Now, this is hypothetical. We're treating all the aid as if it were subject to the governor's proposal, whereas it would only apply to projects approved after July 1st, 2019. Eventually, in 20, 30 years, all projects would be in that category. So this gives us a view of what it would look like. New York City would lose $135 million, and average need and low need districts would lose 9% and 21%, respectively. So the low need districts would be hit the hardest, but other districts would also be affected by this. And I think our overall reaction to this is, don't cut aid, cut costs. If you can reduce the drivers of costs that are making the costs high, then state aid will also decrease. So we, for example, suggest taking a look at the thresholds for having to apply the WICS law that requires separate contractors for heating, plumbing, etc. And seeing if those thresholds maybe should be increased, and then if school districts can save money, and then the state need to pay building aid would be reduced, or increasing the threshold for capital outlay projects, which is currently $100,000 and has been that since 1992. If that were increased to say $250,000, more construction would be paid for each year, and interest costs would be reduced. Reducing costs is the approach that we think makes a lot more sense than just cutting aid, which could result in a shift to the local taxpayer. All right, we lay out some ASBO recommendations for state-aid school districts, and our proposal is on the state budget website. Our big focus is full phase-in of foundation aid. We think that's very important to provide the support that children need to get the education that they deserve to be college and career ready. And we do recognize that the formula does have some age, and there are a number of technical improvements, improving the data, updating weightings in certain categories that can be done. We've done an extensive study of this with a statewide group of school business officials and made a number of recommendations on this, and that also is on our website. We recommended increased support for early learning and aligned ourselves with the region's recommendations for UPK and other early learning initiatives. We proposed taking the community schools set aside out of foundation aid, leaving foundation aid unrestricted, and providing a categorical aid for student safety and wellness, much aligned with the community schools concept, but provided to all school districts, not just high need school districts, for the state to share in the non-capital needs of school districts to ensure student safety and wellness. We also recommend incentives for shared pupil transportation, allowing regional high schools statewide that would promote collaboration and or mergers between school districts, and then to allow the small city school districts to factor anticipated building aid into their debt limits, like all other fiscally independent school districts. We've studied the small city school district situation and spent some time collaborating with small city school districts, and see this restrictive debt limit calculation to be an obstacle to school construction and preventing small city school districts from accessing the building aid that they're entitled to. So in discussions with legislative staff, we steered them to what they should pay attention to about the districts that they're concerned about. They should know, for example, if their school districts are high need, average need, or low need. They should understand whether the districts have foundation aid that is still due, or whether they're on safe harmless. That's a different circumstance. There can be needs in both cases, but it is a different circumstance. They should also look at the trends in student enrollment and need and understand what's happening. Is there a big ELL increase? Is there a big increase in student disabilities? What's happening with economic disadvantage and poverty? How are those changing? That helps you to understand the needs of the school districts. And finally, I think you should ask whether your districts are providing all students with the opportunity for a meaningful education. And certainly, if you answer that question no, then you have foundation aid still due, that would make you concerned about foundation aid and its eventual success. And then lastly, I asked them whether the districts that they're concerned about depend on state support for pupil transportation, BOCES services, and school construction. Those are being targeted by the executive in his proposal for reduction, and to the extent that school districts do depend on those services, it is a concern. We'd like to point you to some resources And the first is to give you just a little background on terminology. Like any complicated area, the terminology is quite plentiful and technical. And so we've divided it into a number of areas. First of all, there are many different pupil counts. And one of the ways we count pupils is by looking at average daily attendance. The other, and this is used in foundation aid, is average daily membership. And membership is the enrollment averaged out every day of the school year. Some of these pupil counts are also weighted for certain categories of students and used for specific formulas such as foundation aid. There are also a number of wealth measures. Combined wealth ratio, I believe Andrew explained that in his presentation, is a mix of property wealth in the district and local income. Pupil wealth ratio is based on property value, and the alternate pupil wealth ratio is based on income value. So in some formulas, they will assess the district's fiscal capacity with one of those three measures. There's also use of the term actual value, which refers to property value. The foundation amount, which is the amount that is required to educate a student, and the sharing ratio or state share. There are a number of measures of student need. We've discussed that to some extent. Difference between economic disadvantage or free reduced price lunch and poverty, and measures of length of earners. Other terms, current year refers to the year in which aid is paid. Base year is the year before that. Local levy is resources raised locally. And Save Harmless refers to the state providing aid to a school district where the formula would actually calculate a loss to hold them harmless against that loss. And then we have our need, resource, capacity categories of school districts, where the school districts, for descriptive purposes, and in some instances as formula components of aid formulas, are classified as high need, average need, or low need. And definitions of many of these measures and state aid acronyms are provided in a handy website, the State Aid Handbook on the State Education Department's website, and I provide you with that link. Other resources, we refer you to our ASBO New York webpage. We have our state budget information page. We have a school district fact book that provides by legislative district details on state aid, building aid, foundation aid still due, enrollments, a number of handy facts that you would have at your fingertips for the districts in each legislative district. We have a number of reports on our ASBO website, including our state aid proposal. And then we look at the impact of the executive and legislative budgets on that website. We have a comparison chart that compares different proposals that are out, a data tool where you can put in a BEDS code and see the aid for individual districts. And we would post webinars on the state budget and any other highlights or additional information that we would get, as well as aid runs. Also on our website, we have our legislative program that we will be working on over the coming months. And then we have a series of reports on topics such as student need, the small city school districts and their debt limit issue, transparency and equity at the school level, school finance primer, and we're going to be, that's a state school finance primer. We're also going to be updating our federal aid primer, and reports on budget votes, tax cap, healthcare costs, etc. Basically, any aspect of school finance and management that we can get data on, we're going to report on. We believe that information helps people to understand the realities of school districts and promote good change. So I would just conclude by thanking you all for listening and encourage you to reach out to us. Send us your questions, your concerns, or if you're interested in a particular analysis for your district or group of districts and you would like to invite us to take a look at that, we would like to hear from you. So I provide our email addresses and hope to hear from you. So with that, we will conclude. Thank you for listening and